The 1980s brought us blockbuster movies, some of which were family movies, some of which were not so family, kind of family movies, but weren't family movies, which led to the PG-13 rating, and some of them were violent, beat 'em up, slash 'em up, shoot 'em up, blow 'em up, action or horror movies of the genre. What's up there, old schoolers? You're kicking it old school. I'm your host, Dr. Old School. Today, I want to discuss a topic that I can remember from childhood. When I was just talking about blockbuster movies of the 1980s, like during the summer and Christmas time, it came to mind back in 1984. There were, I believe, 3 movies that secured PG ratings. And the problem was they were close to almost having an R rating, which would be Gremlins, Ghostbusters, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Spielberg came up with the idea of the PG-13 rating, where it would stand there between PG and R, so that way parents could be cautious about, what their kids are watching. But what I wanted to bring the subject of was some of these movies, they actually became cartoon shows for kids on Saturday morning or weekday mornings or weekday afternoons before and after school. The one that started it all, the real Ghostbusters. Now, granted, I was a huge Ghostbusters fanatic when I was a kid. I mean, my mom and dad took me to see the movie Ghostbusters in 1984 when I was 6 years old, that summer when I turned 6 on my birthday. And before you know it, I was hooked. I was obsessed. I became an instant Ghostbusters fanatic, which also evolved into being a fan of Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, and Chevy Chase. Now, this cartoon show, it was great because it took over after where the first movie had left off. I was constantly faithful to this cartoon on Saturday morning and on the weekdays when they used to play the cartoons before school and after school. As a matter of fact, on the Saturday morning, of all the cartoons I watched in my pajamas till noontime, my mother would be vacuuming the house, knowing I'm good and well I'm trying to watch cartoons, and boy did she give me whoopings for unplugging the vacuum when she'd go through the living room knowing I'm watching my cartoons. But one of the things I wanted to get to was back in the 1980s, when it came to cartoon movies based off cartoons, there was a big thing going on. The real Ghostbusters, which came from the very first movie, what happened was it became a big, successful hit. Kids wanted to be Ghostbusters. Who didn't want to live out the adventures with Peter Venkman, Ray Stantz, Egon Spengler, and Winston Zeddemore? And of course, their sassy Brooklynite secretary Janine, and Slimer, and cruising the Ecto-1, ridding New York of paranormal activity. But, that also started off, Rambo had a cartoon, which was based off an R-rated movie franchise starring Sylvester Stallone, where the cartoon took place where Rambo First Blood Part 2 left off, which saw Rambo going on all these adventures with the government, led by Colonel Troutman, naturally. But what had happened was that cartoon lasted maybe, I think, a year, and then it was canceled. And it had a toy, just like Ghostbusters, it had a toy line to go with it that didn't last long. Now, the real Ghostbusters, they had a toy line going from 1986 to 1991, I think, when the real Ghostbusters was canceled. And, oh man, I absolutely loved Saturday morning seeing the newer adventures with Peter, Ray, Egon, and Winston on what ghoul they're going to bust. But then, it kind of got cheesy because parents were complaining that it was a little violent, a little too scary. So they started making it more kid-friendly, and eventually Slimer got his own, cartoon show called Slimer, and they changed it from the real Ghostbusters to Slimer and the real Ghostbusters. And what had happened was it started to get a little corny. Lorenzo Music was no longer voicing Peter Venkman, which I think he did a good job on the Bill Murray character. And ironically enough, Lorenzo Music, who did supply the voice for Garfield back in the day, there he was supplying the voice for Peter Venkman, who was played by Bill Murray. And what had happened there was, ironically enough, years later, Bill Murray would be the voice of Garfield. How about that one, you know? But what had happened was, I had found out by 4th grade, toward the end of 4th grade that summer, Ghostbusters was going to have a sequel called Ghostbusters 2. It had already spawned the cartoon show, coloring books, bed sheets, t-shirts, toys, video games. I mean, when the Ghostbusters video game finally made its way to the Nintendo Entertainment System, I was very excited because two of my favorite things coming together hand in hand, Nintendo and Ghostbusters. And boy, what a disappointment that game was. It was just a rehashing of the original Commodore game and the Atari 2600 game done for the late 80s. But Ghostbusters fever was hitting the market like crazy toward the end of the 80s. And by the summer of 1989, we ended up getting Ghostbusters 2, which I was very excited to go see. My mom and dad took me to go see that, and I was very excited. I mean, are they going to go ahead and stay canon with, you know, with the real Ghostbusters? Because during real Ghostbusters, as far as we were concerned as kids, they were still out busting ghosts thanks to that cartoon show. Come to find out, needless to say, that, you know, all the events after the first movie took place, the Ghostbusters were out of business. As a matter of fact, they had a restraining order banning them from doing any ghost-busting services. But, you know, still the movie was big, it was great, it was awesome to see our heroes back in the action again. But sadly enough, when the newer season for the real Ghostbusters came out, I was slowly starting to lose interest. So, you know, other blockbuster movie franchises ended up coming out with their own cartoon show. I remember after the real Ghostbusters was over with on TV every Saturday, after that would come Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice would have his own cartoon show, and one of the things I remember, Beetlejuice in the movie, one of my favorite movies of the 1980s, but in many ways for a kid's cartoon, you know, looking back, you know, you look at the movie Beetlejuice and it was kind of vulgar, you know, even though it was PG rated, it had, you know, some crude humor, you know, some sexual innuendos and perversion jokes, but the cartoon proved to be, you know, a success with kids, and it went on for about 3 years, and then Beetlejuice's popularity kind of faded. And Beetlejuice actually had an action figure line from Kenner, just as well as the real Ghostbusters. Yeah, I know I need a haircut. I don't know, I think I'll keep it like this. But what had happened was, you see, a lot of things were changing by the 1990s. I mean, yeah, sure, you know, other franchises, I mentioned the Rambo cartoon, Rambo: The Force of Freedom, and I thought to myself, I look back, I can't believe they were able to take, from an R-rated movie, a government-trained killing machine and make him into a kid's hero with action figures. Some people would joke, oh, you might as well give Charles Manson his own cartoon show where he's a hero, and you got Susan Atkins and Tex Watson as his allies fighting the forces of evil. That's only a joke, people. But as years progressed, you know, after the popularity of Ghostbusters had faded, they did come out with another cartoon show in the late 90s with a toy line that didn't last long called Extreme Ghostbusters. I tried to watch it, and as a fan, I was not impressed. I was not impressed at all, and it's like, you know what? The original movies are classic. The original cartoon's a classic. Let's just put it to bed. And then in 2009, Atari came out with a Ghostbusters video game written by Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis themselves, with everybody except for Sigourney Weaver and Rick Moranis reprising their roles as the characters. But, you know, I remember thinking to myself, okay, this is the ultimate third movie right here, because we've been, as Ghostbusters fan, I had been praying for a third Ghostbusters movie since the second one. But what we got since, I mean, they've been passing around scripts over the years. Dan Aykroyd has pitched a couple scripts, so has Harold Ramis. But sadly, in 2014, we lost Harold Ramis, so we thought that, you know, it wouldn't happen. So they did come out with a third Ghostbusters movie, but what it was it was a reboot, starring Melissa McCarthy and Kate McKinnon and Leslie Jones and Kristen Wiig, called simply Ghostbusters. It was the same concept. It was a reboot, but, it was a different story, different characters, and it was panned by critics really terribly. I happen to enjoy it. I'm the kind of guy when it comes to stuff like this, where one of my favorite film franchises comes out with a long-awaited sequel or a reboot, and everybody just pans it, I just say, you know what? Let's be grateful. Finally we're getting a movie of this again. Let's be grateful. But I'm getting off the subject here. The subject was about blockbuster movies from the 80s getting their own cartoon show for kids and toy lines. Others that went ahead and did that was The Karate Kid. It says the Karate Kid cartoon only lasted about 13 episodes, and what it was about was Daniel and Mr. Miyagi going across the globe trying to find a magical shrine, Okinawan shrine, to keep it from the bad guys. I only watched a couple episodes because, needless to say, it didn't last very long. And another film franchise that got its own cartoon show for kids only lasted about 2 years, and I was surprised because even though, again, it was PG rated, still had a little bit of crude humor to it, was Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Now, just like the real Ghostbusters, there were things about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures that I didn't care for. Like, for instance, at the end of the first movie, because there were two movies, there was Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and then in between the cartoon show was Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Now, and another one I want to get with is about, the Rambo cartoon as well, where they didn't have the princess girlfriends that they ended up getting at the end of the first movie. They were still back in high school, but there they were going back in time with Rufus to get, historical figures for more history reports like you saw in the movie. And then by the time Bogus Journey came out, again, I was glad that cartoon faded, because it's really a disappointment when they forget key characters. Like in the real Ghostbusters, even the cartoon shows after Ghostbusters 2, they left out Dana Barrett, who was Sigourney Weaver's character in both movies. I mean, in the first run of the cartoon, before, in between both movies, they forgot Louis Tully as well. But after Ghostbusters 2, they decided to have Louis Tully in there, but not have Dana Barrett. And I found that disappointing. And another thing disappointing about the Rambo cartoon is where after First Blood Part 2, it seems that Rambo's going on all these government missions with Colonel Troutman and a government-trained team known as the Force of Freedom against the terrorist group Savage, which was kind of like a ripoff of G.I. Joe, between G.I. Joe and Cobra. But what happened was disappointing, and I'm glad that cartoon series didn't last, nor did the toy line, was a couple years later we had Rambo 3 come out, Sylvester Stallone returning, and it turns out all his time after First Blood Part 2, he had been living in Asia, and he had been stick fighting. He'd been doing warehouse, fighting, kind of like prize fighting, in Taiwan, and living in a Buddhist temple, fixing things and everything. So Rambo never went on those adventures, and that was kind of disappointing. I mean, the only cartoon I can think of that was, and they kept on doing this throughout the 90s too, with like Men in Black and, whatever, Jumanji and Free Willy, which, Men in Black, I saw a few episodes and and I was never I never watched Free Willy, and, Jumanji was okay, was a good movie. I mean, put Robin Williams in anything back then and it was gold. It was a good movie, but, it didn't need the cartoon series. I mean, the only other cartoon based off a movie that I really loved besides the real Ghostbusters was Back to the Future. It was educational. I mean, there were some things like one of Doc Brown's kids drained the battery on the DeLorean, watching a video in there or something like that, and they were stuck in the age of dinosaurs. So it was Vern that did that, and then Doc Brown and Jules had to figure out a way to jumpstart the DeLorean to get it up to 88 miles an hour to get back to the present, without jumper cables to another battery. So what they did was they would do things like, they hooked the DeLorean up to lemon trees, and with lemon juice, they powered the DeLorean's battery, and they took off up to 88 miles an hour, came back to the present. And they would do stuff, when they would talk about that Christopher Lloyd would appear as live action Doc Brown, and what he would do was, after that cartoon was over, what he would do was he would show you with Bill Nye the Science Guy on how you could power things by using lemon juice. And it was a real cool thing. It did take place after part 3. And, well, needless to say, it didn't really last long. I guess it was too educational, because we were getting to the point where, educational stuff wasn't cool anymore. And Back to the Future cartoon came out at a good time. After the success of the third movie, Universal had opened Back to the Future The Ride at Universal Studios in Orlando, Florida, which closed down about 10 years ago or so to make room for the Simpsons ride. But yeah, that's kind of my take. If anybody remembers those cartoons based on movies back in the late 80s and early 90s, yeah, you'll know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I just wanted to go ahead and, try and do something different. I'm starting to make videos again. I enjoy making videos for you. I just found out I got my 13th subscriber, and it's kind of sad after, having this channel 2 years, but I do honestly hope for more subscribers. Like I said, if you're new to the channel, subscribe, hit that bell, and, give me a like, a thumbs up, or a thumbs down, comment, tell me what you think about my videos. I would love to correspond with you, and to the subscribers that I have, the 13, it's only been 13 in 2 years, but still, I thank you. I'm glad that I can entertain you with my videos, and I promise you, I'm going to have more videos on the way. This is Dr. Old School saying, Godspeed, and may the Force be with you.